Hello, everybody. I'm Luke Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, coming to you today from Wurundjeri Land here in Melbourne. Yes, I'm wearing a woolen sweater. Yes, it is December 14. What's going on? I don't know. This is something called climate change. I think it might be having a little bit of an impact around the place. But anyway, it is a delight to be with you today to unpack the latest outcomes of an ongoing project which is near and dear to my heart, which is collaboration between Australia and Germany on energy efficiency, and specifically a delegation that I led back in June to look at energy efficiency in buildings. And I'm going to welcome our panelists in a moment, but it's incumbent on me to provide a little bit of context for those of you that haven't been following the blow by blow on social media. There's been a collaboration between Australia and Germany on energy between I guess the current time and right back to 2017, as it was then, the Energy and Resources Working Group was founded, as tends to be the case when these sorts of bilateral partnerships are started. It was very broad at the beginning. Over the course of the first year, the resources stuff got broken out and focused in on energy. And then there was work over 2018 to 2019 to say, well, energy is a big topic. What are we really interested in? And at the meeting of the German government, the Australian government, and the industry stakeholders that are part of that forum, two priorities were identified. One was hydrogen, and there has been a fair bit of attention paid in the energy space to the opportunity around hydrogen export. That is a role that Germany sees itself having in terms of driving demand for hydrogen around the world, and they see that as part of their transition. But the other one, which is what we're going to be talking about today, was energy efficiency. And I got tapped on the shoulder to be the Australian co-chair of representing the Australian energy efficiency industry of the energy efficiency sub-working group to the Australia-German energy working group. It's a bit of a mouthful. I've said it a few times. It's starting to roll off the tongue. And at that time, my co-chair was Christoph von Spessart, who was very involved with our sister organisation in Germany, DENEF, the German Business Initiative for Energy Efficiency, and was also, for various work reasons, in Australia at the time. He ultimately became the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce here in Sydney. And so fantastic energy efficiency defined as a priority. We required a process which focused it in even further. So were we talking about buildings? Were we talking about industry? Were we talking about the energy system? And the view from the Australian and German governments, which was clarified in around that time, was that they wanted to focus specifically on buildings. In the first instance, those other things aren't important, but we felt that there was an opportunity in buildings, but we needed to scope in, well, what in buildings? Even that's a big topic, obviously, which resulted in the EEC and the German Chamber in Australia being commissioned to do this report called Further, Faster, Together, which mapped the relative strengths of both Australia and Germany on building energy efficiency, and found that they were quite complementary. We have the world-leading Neighbours program, which has been driving incredible outcomes in the commercial building space, and Germany are way ahead on residential energy efficiency, and specifically residential energy efficiency financing. And so the outcome of that report was, well, yes, there is a lot to work on together, a lot of knowledge exchange that would really be valuable, and that investing in that exchange was going to be something that would benefit both nations. Subsequently, those two priorities have been unpacked in detail in a couple of reports. The Neighbours team did what's known affectionately as the Global Guide, which explains what Neighbours is for an international audience. There's lots of information around about Neighbours, but it assumes a certain amount of knowledge because we're so familiar with it in the industry here in Australia. And so it actually went through the origins of Neighbours and explained the value that it's provided to the market here in Australia. And similarly, on the German side, Adelphi, who's one of the key partners for this whole relationship, undertook some deep dive research into the KfW Bank and the role that it plays in residential energy efficiency financing, which is an incredible resource because there's so little available in English about the role that the KfW plays. And so that's a wonderful resource as we consider what we're doing on that front here in Australia. So that gets us to about the start of 2022. And at that point, happily and incredibly, the German government said, well, look, we want to sort of build on this momentum, and we want to bring a group of Australians over to Berlin to engage on this topic of energy efficiency. And they actually put their hand up to co-fund the delegation, so 10, 11 Australians got supported to travel to Australia from not-for-profits, from think tanks, from industry associations, from government, and from businesses as well, to go to Berlin and participate in a 4-day program, which was really looking at energy efficiency in the building space from the perspective of policy, of technology, of market development, of workforce development, all of these different lenses, including a bunch of site visits, looking at how technology was being applied and how financing and policy was driving developments in the market. It was an incredible opportunity, and we, as you would expect, had an amazing response and convened an amazing delegation, as I say, 10 or 11 folk who participated in this session. I'm going to pause my story at that point because I'm getting a bit lonely, and I want to introduce our panelists. The first thing I'll say is, unfortunately, Margot Delafaluz from ClimateWorks, unable to join us today, has had some issues that she's had to deal with, and so she's an apology. But I'm delighted to welcome Carlos Flores, Director of the National Australian Built Environment Rating System. Neighbours has already got a few shout-outs. Hello, Carlos.
Hello, Luke. It's great to be here.
Also, Rachel Haley, Manager, Sustainable Homes in the New South Wales Government.
Hi, Luke.
Great to have you with us,
Yeah,
Rachel.
It's great to be here too.
Great. And Frankie Muscovich, National Policy Director at Property Council of Australia and co-host of the Let Me Sum Up podcast. Welcome, Frankie.
I knew you were going to shoehorn that in somewhere, Luke, and really lovely to join this group of people from Gadigal land today. Feels like a nice time for a fireside chat at the end of the year. Well,
that's what I want, is because it was a great privilege for us, but also all of the fellow delegates to be on this delegation. And this, rather than sort of barreling on with the story, I thought I'd bring the three of you in so that people aren't just listening to me drone on. I guess my question, and I'm happy for any of you to pick this up, like, what did you expect going into the delegation, and then what was it actually like over the course of those 4 days? Did the expectations match up with the actual experience in Berlin?
And expectations met and surpassed. I think I underestimated how affecting it would be to be on the ground in Germany at this time, especially. So we landed there right in the midst of really when the energy crisis, that's now a global energy crisis, was sort of well and truly in train. And I was really actually quite moved by a lot of particularly the bureaucrats that we met, but also a couple of politicians that spoke really forcefully about the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine and the impact that was having, given Germany's history, especially on the approach that they were taking, both to respond to that sort of geopolitical crisis, but in sort of doing that, combining the measures they were taking with climate action as well. I underestimated, I think, the impact that would have. I don't know about the others.
I think what I'll add to that, completely agree. I think it exceeded I had high expectations, and they were significantly exceeded once we were there. I think one of my big takeaways from that is that, if you go around Australia in the building sector, the amount of ideas that have been thrown at the table is immense, right? And we've tried a lot of things, and some things have worked out, some things haven't yet. And so Germany's been doing the same, but they are different people in a different country, in a different continent. So they've actually tried a bunch of things that we haven't tried. We've tried a bunch of things that they haven't tried, and I actually hadn't appreciated just how much we can really learn from each other and move a lot faster. And I think that week clarified that in my mind very quickly. Within 2 days, I feel like I was learning more than I had in months, just because there was so much new content and so many, wins and losses in the last few years that we could learn from. I think that was incredibly instructive.
Yeah, I agree. And just to build off that, I wasn't expecting the camaraderie and the connection with the other Australian delegates that we made when we went over there. We were like Team Australia in our camp, having breakfast, going off and learning things. And it was 24/7 talking about what we were learning. It was really a in-depth learning experience, but getting to know the other Australians in the group was excellent.
Yeah. And I think one of the real strengths was just the diversity of perspectives around the group. And so, as you say, it was a packed program, but at the end of the day, we're kind of teasing out, like, what are the real lessons of this? What's Germany's doing well? What wouldn't we want to replicate? How would this apply in Australia? And you had sort of industry expertise, you had program expertise, you had finance expertise around the table, as well as other views, and it was just so rich, the conversations that happened over the course of the 4 days. So I think that was one of the motivations for where we are now, right? So at the end of those 4 days, the delegation got together. It was sort of an unscheduled roundtable. It was like, well, we can't just all sort of, disappear into the night. Like, we've really got to go, well, what are we going to do with all this? And I think there was a strong sense, and certainly I felt this, and I think others felt this, like a sense of, the great privilege of being flown to Germany and learning all this stuff, and a sense that it was incumbent upon us to share that as best as we can. And so there was a conversation about what some of the key themes were that we, so as a group, that came out of that final session, and ultimately what transpired once we got back was there was a view, particularly we had representatives, you, Rachel, representing the New South Wales government, but also we had Paul Corkle from Solar Victoria, representing the Victorian government, and the view from those two governments as well. And was that so much insights had been generated, it was going to be really important to capture them. And so you commissioned the report, and we got Patrick Critton on board as someone that wasn't on the delegation, but has a lot of expertise in this space to kind of unpack those insights and actually get them down into something that people could get their arms around. They could flick through it. It's a relatively short read, but it's kind of like the crystallization of the views, which we captured through a series of workshops, sort of picking up on each of those themes that we identified on the last day of the delegation. And so that's what we're here to do today, is to launch the report, but also talk about some of those themes.
I think it's really important, and I think we all felt the responsibility to do as much as we possibly could to disseminate the learnings from that week. It is a privilege, and I think it came also at a very auspicious time in a way. Like, it's an extraordinary time in terms of global energy policy, but it was, there was also a lot going on back at home. We just had a federal election. We had a posturing from the new government that was quite a contrast from the previous government. And I think there was a feeling that it was an opportunity-rich environment to import some of the best learnings and insights, and in a way hope to sort of accelerate. And I think, to Carlos's point early on, we don't have to make the same mistakes here when we can look at what countries like Germany, who are very advanced in their thinking and sort of application of implementation of programs, to not have to do everything that they've done to arrive at the same position. We were able of leapfrogging in a way on a few things.
Yep. So I should say for everyone online live with us today, and we're going to keep this pretty informal. We're going to work through the 4 themes and have a conversation about those as we go through. There is going to be a dedicated Q&A time at the end of the discussion, but I'd encourage you, if you've got questions or comments, just weave them in, and to the degree they're relevant to what we're talking about at the time, I'll try and knock them over as we go. So don't feel shy. If you've got a particular curly question you want to throw at our panelists, I'll enjoy doing that. So shall we dive in? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Sounds great.
Let's do it. So I think one of the absolutely show-stopping themes that we spent a lot of time talking about over the course of the whole week, and particularly at that final roundtable, was the role of leadership and particularly government leadership, setting ambition, tracking progress, the kind of the enabling environment, which for us, yes, there'd recently been an election. We're sort of reflecting on the role of national governments in kind of creating that environment for the swift acceleration of action on energy efficiency. Frankie, on that broad topic of leadership, what really sticks with you from that time in Germany?
I thought the insights from being able to talk to the teams within the German government that were responsible for delivering this really added a lot of colour and insight into, I think, what at least some of us from Australia perceived at a distance was, an awful lot of investment from the German government that goes into supporting, stronger efficiency, particularly in the residential sector. I think we sort of went into this going, we could learn a lot from them on the residential side, and perhaps we have a bit to share on the commercial side of things. But I think what we all learned the most was around what some of the structural kind of like the infrastructure looked like that supported that from a legislative perspective. It's very, surprisingly for Germany, it's very organised, and there's really clear accountability put in place. And I think it was like refreshing as Australians who I think have not had that infrastructure in place at a national level for a really long time, to see just how effective things like legislated targets at an economy-wide level, but also at a sectoral level could have. And I think it was striking for the industry people and the delegation, as well as the government people in the delegations. I think like Carlos and Rachel also, I think, came at it from a different perspective, but we all furiously agreed that these were really great things. So like in brief, the German government has more ambitious economy-wide emissions reduction targets than the rest of the EU. They've legislated to go net zero by 2045. They've got, I think, a 65% emissions reduction by 2030 target. I think it's 88% by 2040, so very ambitious. But under that, they've also got sectoral targets, including one for buildings. And I think the buildings target for 2030 is around 43% or so. But, regardless of what the numbers do, they have to report on their progress against those targets annually. So there is no chance for you to go set some programs in place and then look at doing some form of monitoring and verification in, 4 or 5 years' time. Every year, they have to track progress against that target. And if they're not hitting where they where the sort of projections suggest they should be, they have to revise the programs they've got in place or design new ones, or remove things that aren't working. And that kind of, I think, accountability, I think, was something very novel for the Australians on the delegation. And, and I know some of the government representatives that were along for the trip were looking at that, I think, rather enviously, if that's fair to say, Carlos and Rachel.
Yeah, totally. I think the point you're making is so important to reflect on, because to me, it was maybe the number one takeaway from the whole trip for me is the these sectoral targets, what they mean for a policymaker. So I work for government. I work with most policy teams from most states in the Commonwealth for the past decade. And what we've seen consistently, because we only have often a national target, like really high level targets, but not broken down by sectors, is that, and they feel really distant, right? Like net zero by 2050 is in 3 decades from now. So what happens in the intervening time is that some sectors get the right level of investment and attention, and others just don't. And that's probably because, investing in some areas is more flashy, is more interesting, is more visible. But the ones that are not as visible often don't get the attention because the targets are so far away that you don't really get the pressure of having to work on all the areas that need attention. And I think in Germany, because they're broken down by sector and you have to report annually and you have to meet those targets, there is that pressure that if any sector is actually staying behind, you need to look into that sector and say, well, what are we going to do? Because we need to catch up by next year or in 2 years from now. And we had a really concrete example of that during the trip. We're looking at the targets on buildings in particular. And some sectors were ahead or kind of on track to meet their 2025, 2030 targets, but buildings weren't. So they've actually done a lot of investment on subsidies and grants. They've also done building code upgrades very recently, earlier in the year, and they realized that those were not enough. So they were coming up with new policy ideas about how do we bring the building sector on track? What are we not doing at the moment? Whereas in Australia, if we pass the building code, often we would think of like, okay, great. Well, we don't really need to do anything until the next building code upgrade in 6 years from now, because there's no targets and there's no tracking by building sector. So it feels like just passing the building code is enough, but no one's actually tracking whether we're in a trajectory to actually get to net zero targets as fast as we can on all sectors. So I thought it was fascinating to see how those targets are driving policymaking that otherwise wouldn't happen. And I think I saw in the National Energy Performance Strategy that is in consultation at the moment here in Australia, and mention about, would it be valuable to have more granular targets, particularly on energy performance? And the first thing I thought about was like, wow, we have an example in Germany of how that's making a huge difference. And I thought, well, that's one of the things that we could really use in taking from Germany and applying here in Australia.
One of the other things that, oh, sorry, you go, Rachel.
No, it's okay. I was just going to build off that and just say that the integration across government. So it's not just looking at it from just one department, it's across many departments. And I think that will lead into our next topic about the ecosystem approach. But I saw this really on the ground when we visited the Tegel Airport, where that development was bringing in a whole of government approach to the transition. So it had energy and renewable energy, building materials, reusing them, nature, walking, economy, like it was really integrated. And I think that's what those targets do. It diversifies responsibility just away from one department and makes it a whole of government responsibility, which means that you bring a whole of government expertise and knowledge to all of those topics.
So we should say the Tegel Airport, like a decommissioned airport, which was, when we visited it back in June, was in the midst of this transformation to this. I'm trying to remember. It was like a mixed-use development. It had like an industrial sector. It had residential space. It had commercial and a shopping district, and they had set up this kind of unusual governance structure that had the kind of sustainability outcomes for the development kind of embedded at it, and reflects what you're saying, Rachel, is that that focus, in terms of the high level sort of economy wide targets, it trickles down to the ground in a way in Germany, which is really quite impressive. I'm sure it doesn't always work perfectly, and obviously on the tour we saw some of the shining lights of where it was working well, but it was interesting to see how it was pushing people to do things a little bit differently in all kinds of contexts, and that development was certainly one of them.
One of the other things that I think might surprise Australians to know, but was interesting to again hear from people on the ground about, and presents us an opportunity to do a bit of a leapfrog, as it were, was that, Germany, well, and the bureaucrats that we spoke to didn't think that Germany was immune from energy efficiency being like the poor sister to the sort of juggernaut of the supply side debate in the context of the crisis. That with all the ambition that they already have, it's sort of not a baseline that we could necessarily relate to from which they're starting. But there was a concern within the German government that energy efficiency was being deprioritized to a certain extent in the face of like incredible challenges around the pressing need to diversify away from Russian gas, for example. So whilst we were there, they were in the process of doing, I think, a lot of the early work on putting together an Energy Efficiency Act, which would have seen, which will see, I think, a target just for energy efficiency that cuts across the economy as well. So we talked about sectoral targets. I think there was also an acknowledgement from the government that in order to see things like energy efficiency, which are absolutely crucial for all the reasons that everyone, in this webinar already knows, really needs to stay front and center. And so they thought that it was important that having a specific target for energy efficiency that as a cross-cutting measure was something that they needed to do. And they sort of, I think when we were there, had started the work on that. The other one that I found fascinating, and I'm not sure presents an opportunity to change the way that we do things here in Australia, but my impression was that the German government was fairly entrepreneurial about the kinds of policies that they would take on board. So when we would ask the folks at KfW, who must be the repository of enormous sort of impressive data sets on the performance of homes, noting the kind of programs that they've run over time, what the cost benefit analysis was for the specific programs they were running. Like, they didn't know, because at a principled level, they said, we need to act, this is what we're doing. There wasn't the agonization from within government to sort of do that cost benefit analysis to make sure that you could justify before having started anything you needed to meet a specific benchmark. I think they had because the issue's been bipartisan there for a really long time, I think there wasn't that scrapping, I think, at the outset about what merited a focus from government investment. So in that sense, I actually think it's very entrepreneurial the way they go about it.
It's Frankie, the point you're making is really fascinating. I think on the one hand, when we talked about cost benefit, I came with I think that the fact that Australian governments in particular put so much effort and focus into that is sometimes a real strength. Sometimes it's like when you have multiple ways you can spend that money on is you want to make the most out of that, and I think that's a good thing that we have in Australia. But on the other hand, we actually have seen that in sectors, particularly on areas like energy efficiency, a lot of the action is very limited to, it needs to make more savings than the cost of implementing. And the building sector is kind of subjected to that rule throughout. And I think the problem with that is that in climate change, in many areas, actually decarbonizing costs us money, especially at the beginning when you're developing new technologies. And part of the reason why we have had maybe a slower uptake on areas like electrification in buildings in Australia is because the market is small. At the beginning, might cost more for a lot of sites. And so if you do a cost benefit analysis on that on a policy today, the answer might be, hey, in some cases, actually might cost more money because the market is not developed enough. And though some of those things, some of that thinking is actually preventing us to realize that we need to develop this market and we have only 20, 25 years to solve that problem. We need to start yesterday. We haven't really started when it comes to government policy. And we need to accept that in some areas, there will be a cost, just like there's a cost for decarbonizing industry and steel making, for example. There's a cost to do that. And the cost might not be cost effective for a couple of decades. I think the building sector could really use some of that. And you can see it in German thinking that they know that there is a cost in transitioning at the beginning in a lot of these sectors, and they're willing to do that. And I think it's really important that we internalize that thought, that cost benefit analysis and cost effectiveness is important, but also a lot of areas have a cost that someone needs to take on, and often that means government.
I think it goes, and maybe this is where we can we can circle back to before we move on to our next theme. Like the target that's the leadership. It's not just having a target, it's saying this is a non-negotiable. Like we have our role to play in mitigating dangerous climate change. And then you go, well, how can we do that most cost effectively? How can we do that in a way that brings the society along with us? How do we sort of maintain, our industrial base? All of these other things that are also non-negotiables, but that ambition doesn't give way to those other considerations. It's tough, right? Like it's really tough. Like this is an unprecedented economic transformation that we're working our way through, but without that clear line of sight, that ambition, but also following it through, it's very easy for other stuff to get in the way. I've just one final point. As we speak, that work that we were briefed on back in June around an efficiency target, that's continuing along through the legislative process. And my understanding is that in December, they're looking at draft laws and they're looking at targets for 2030, 2040 and 2045, both for primary energy and final energy. So they're going to have those two lenses in. So they are taking that next step, as well as have those emissions reduction targets, and then those broken down by sector, saying that that's not enough. We also need to have this dashboard of what's going on in terms of energy efficiency right across the economy.
We have a national energy performance strategy out for consultation now. So in that sense, honestly, I think if we hadn't been over there, it's really easy for us to be a little bit blinkered in Australia and not, be paying close attention to the way that other jurisdictions are moving on these things, or certainly not to have a granular enough understanding to then say, well, actually, that's the result of, some pretty considered and long-term, action and investment from the government in a German context. And even with the level of ambition and bipartisanship that they've had over the last 3 and 4 decades, they still feel there's a really strong rationale for having an energy efficiency target, embedded in legislation. So it's a really obvious thing and a pertinent thing for us to be thinking about in Australia in the context of that strategy.
All right. So theme 2, the residential ecosystem, how that all works together. That's something I think we were all really interested in. Germany has had more policy in this space for a lot longer than Australia has. We're right in the midst of trying to work out, well, how do we drive activity in this space? There was Carlos was talking earlier about upgrades to the National Construction Code. We've just had a significant step forward on residential buildings, but this other great task of fixing the existing buildings and not just having the code updated for new buildings, like that's still before us. Rachel, what were your big takeouts? We talked to financiers, we talked to practitioners, we talked to policymakers. What were the insights that you drew from looking at the German residential upgrade ecosystem in some detail?
I think that their approach really acknowledges the complexity of this task that we have ahead of us, that transitioning buildings, which every single one of us work in and live in, is an enormous task. And so you can't really rely on just one single policy to enable that. You really need to have a concerted effort across government. And there are multiple barriers that are preventing us from transitioning that sector. So for Germany, they've recognized, so the targets are one, but there are financial barriers, which they've set up the system with KfW. Every building is different. So they have each building, if you want to upgrade it, you can have an assessor come and visit you and develop your own personal roadmap for your building so that you can upgrade it over time, because often it is something that you do not as just one-off, but over time. And they have a mechanism which then the assessor comes back and verifies it. So that's where the financial incentive gets verified so that you can get paid for that. And then I think then they have a whole system about the skills and development of trades and assessors as well. So I just think that was really impressive. And I want to give ourselves a little pat on the back, just a tiny one, is that in Australia, we have acknowledge this in the draft national framework for disclosure of energy efficiency information, which the jurisdictions have been working on. It does actually acknowledge the need for an ecosystem approach in that document. So the foundation for us in Australia is there. Disclosure in of itself is probably the foundational policy, which all of these other things will hang off. So we are starting to take steps in that direction here in Australia, but I do think we can learn a lot from Germany.
Maybe just to jump in on what you said, Rachel, I think one thing that was very striking for me in visiting in this during that week, going to Berlin, is we actually did a lot of site visits on what this looked like in practice. This ecosystem, some of the policies, we had conversations with people in those communities. So sometimes we went particularly with quite a bit of like medium density residential development. Sometimes, you know, a building with a few units, you know, 6, 10, 12 units, sometimes multiple blocks of that, because that's a lot of the housing in Berlin in particular, and also in a lot of Europe. And it was fascinating to see this in practice, like systems running all electric, very energy efficient, retrofits of existing housing. And by that, I don't mean like cosmetic or relatively small impacts, like the ones that we talked about in Australia all the time, like draft proofing, things that you can do with low amounts of money and relatively low skills. I'm talking about like comprehensive upgrades of building facades, with full electrified systems, with solar integration, with control, so the systems more or less run themselves and no one has to be there actively. With some multiple systems like that, and Germany has actually done thousands and thousands of those kind of developments. And I was thinking, what would it take for a future where that was normal here in Australia as well? Because we do need that. We have very, 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 very poor building stock residential. I think that's universally recognized. But I was like, even if we had like the right policy today, we couldn't really do it overnight because we don't have the skills, the products, so we're actually looking at a lot of those projects in reality. I was like, this is the result of a decade of policy making and a lot of different interventions. That means that Germany could put things in place in January 2023, and have them up and running at scale within months, because they've done that investment up front. And that's why it's so important for, you know, investing on these foundational policies like Rachel's talking about, in disclosure in particular, because we have to have foundations to build a lot of these incentives in the future. And currently that foundation is very thin in the Australian residential property sector.
I was so frustrated being over there and thinking about the time we've lost in Australia on this particular part of our policy ecosystem. And, you know, the infuriating thing really is to look at what we've done on the commercial side of things. And, you know, I'm probably a little bit of a harsher critic, perhaps, of what's been going on in Australia to a certain extent, because I think we've really suffered from a lack of leadership at the national level. And I think understandably, states have sought to fill that void, and you can't, you know, of course you wouldn't blame them for doing that, but are we going to be well served, you know, by having 8 different approaches to this in Australia? Like, no, we're not, was the clear takeout from my perspective. And so, you know, I have a lot of hope in sort of the early work on the REDI that Rachel's referring to. But I also I just want to caution against us thinking we have to import or start from the ecosystem that we've already had in this country, from where the sort of new build plethora of different tools that can be accredited under a framework. I thought some of the biggest strengths of what happens in Germany, and we talk about efficiency house is the standard that they refer to, which is consistent between new build and the retrofit space. When you're talking about performance levels, the same language is used. I want to underestimate the impact that can have on fostering that ecosystem where you've got professionals who are, you know, accredited, through, I can't remember the name of like the authority that does that, but there's an accreditation. They're required to verify that performance is achieved in order to access some of the blended finance and grants that KfW offer. But it's one thing. It's communicated really simply. It's powerfully backed in by the development bank's finance. And I just so think like we needed to have done this 10 years ago. And I really feel the urgency about moving quickly and decisively on this issue in Australia, because I think we've probably been a little bit nice about letting things kind of bumble along the last few years. And we're still not really close to really kind of launching into this. And so I'm looking for leadership from governments. I know I think the NEPS is a really strong platform for that. And I'll stop my rant here. But I think we're all super passionate about this. And when you see how well it can be done, I think so bringing that ambition back here is something we should really strive to replicate and build on.
Well, as you said earlier, the timing's perfect, right? Like to have had that insight into what's working well in Germany, also things that we wouldn't want to replicate in that space. I think being able to feed it in right now, new government, we've got this inflection point where we have the National Energy Performance Strategy that's under development. And I think a recognition that the performance of our buildings is going to be a critical KPI. But I saw, Rachel, you were coming off mute.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say that, just linking off what Frankie just said about the use of KfW in using the carrot, I suppose, to move the market for new buildings. And I think they're just about to do it for heat pumps, getting the market to shift and then bringing the regulation in. And it seemed, I suppose, from what it wasn't easy. They explained that there were still bumps, but I think that approach was quite interesting.
Probably shouldn't understate the impact of that. I think there's sort of one specific program that they'd been running for well over a decade with an incredibly generous incentive, and probably something we couldn't necessarily hope to replicate in Australia. It was like 20 billion euro a year, and it was targeted at supporting people to build, above the minimum standard in the building code for new buildings. And no such incentive at that level was available for existing buildings, which is crazy. And they had sort of said, yeah, we've stopped, incentivizing quite so much for new buildings because they've been running it for a decade, right? So they sort of de facto, they sort of changed what the minimum was because the incentive was so substantial. No one would build to the minimum standard because you could get in order of 70 to 80,000 euros grant, and then about the same amount again as sort of, low to no interest loans to upgrade your home. Like, of course, you're going to take that deal. So they've effectively bought their way, to a higher standard of performance. And I think it's probably not insignificant to note how much that would have helped shift industry's views and support of increasing the minimum standards. So, I think there's probably a mixed lesson in that for us.
Yes, I agree.
Is there anything else that any of you wanted to shout out in terms of the residential ecosystem, Carlos?
Only that I mean, there's a link directly to skills that I think is worthwhile. Now that we've talked plenty about the ecosystem and how it works and incentives, building codes, I think it's just worth talking about what it means on the ground in terms of skills. And I often think about the link between government policies and skills in two ways. First is that policies build skills, right? So if you create a minimum, if you uplift the building code and suddenly you require double glazed facades, the industry very quickly is going to become much better at installing them and getting those products in the market, and the price will come down and all of that. So that angle is really interesting. But the other angle about if you want to do really ambitious things with policy, you often require this to build this skills force before you actually can take those ambitious steps. And I think the way that electrification is being taken on in Germany, but not just in Germany, also in Italy and the UK, several countries that have electrification policies, is that they've actually gone down the path of step one is We need to build a market so people can build those skills. And the market can be as ambitious as you want to be. You can start with, 1,000 homes a year, or 100,000 homes a year, or 1 million homes a year. But it's important to actually have a set of policies that create a certain market for electrification, because what happens is you get a lot of the electricians and plumbers who in Australia are not very interested today in taking part of that market because there's not a lot of demand, there's not a lot of products, it's difficult, it's different than we've done before. So Germany actually created a lot of these subsidies, which created demand for electrification. And a lot of people jump in because there was a business opportunity. And 20 buildings later, they are experts on electrifying buildings. They can train others, they can skill up, expand their companies. And so Germany went from having maybe 30,000 electrified homes a year 4 or 5 years ago to having 70,000 about 3 years ago, to having more than 150,000, I think, in 2022, and with a target of electrifying 500,000 homes by 2024. And that's nowhere near enough the level of annual electrification to get to net zero emissions by 2045. They still need to keep growing that, but they're actually on a trajectory where when you're electrifying 500,000 homes a year, you know that you can get to the 1 million homes a year or 2 million homes a year. It's just a matter of continuing that trajectory because you have the workforce, you have the products, you have the skills. And so I look at what's happening in Germany in that space, and then I look at Australia, where about half of the housing stock has gas on site. And about another half that doesn't have it through a pipe has it through liquefied, like LPG. So a huge part, the majority of homes in Australia use gas in one shape or another. Most policy making internationally and domestically have said that we probably need to electrify all those homes. So we need a skill force of tens of thousands of professionals with experience that can electrify lots of homes in an incredibly short amount of time. And we just don't have it right now. We don't have the policies to build that. We don't have targets we don't have that target of 1,000, the very modest 1,000 homes a year or 10,000 homes a year. We're not even at that stage. We're not where Germany was 10 years ago. But we have to get to net zero emissions by about the same time. And the challenge is actually, we tend to think that because Australia is warmer, the challenge is a lot smaller. But the reality is that, yeah, we use less gas as a proportion in a lot of our residential homes, but we use gas in most of them. So most of them still require that upgrade. And every year that passes when we don't have these policies to create the market, I get more and more nervous because you can see how the runway is getting shorter and shorter. The challenge is tremendous. And we're not doing much at the moment to actually have a skilled workforce in a year or two with a lot more people that have experience to be able to do this. Frankie and Rachel, I wonder what you think about that point.
Well, on the skills piece, I mean, you spoke a lot about electrification, but it's true across the board. And perhaps the other thing I really took away, and I think Carlos, you even touched on it, on some of the examples that we saw of buildings that had, we're talking about World War II era or earlier, 3-story, 4-story walk-up apartment buildings. Going through really significant refurbishments, but they're doing it, in one go. And so I think having that ecosystem, or what we don't have is that at scale. It's not just about the, bringing the plumbers and the electricians together to do the electrification piece of it. It's like, how do you do insulation at the same time, and look at creating the business model that's going to support deep retrofits at scale. So I think Rachel's point about disclosure underpinning it all is fundamental. Once you've got the measuring stick in place, then you can hang, all the incentive programs you like off that, and a workforce will start to come through over time because, you would hope we can be innovative and let the marketplace kind of decide what the best offerings are. But I also think it's really naive to expect that can spool up quickly overnight. And when you looked at the ambition that's there in Germany, and them are saying, as ambitious as they are, they don't think they can meet the targets that they've got because they don't have the right people, enough of the people with the right skills. I think all of us saw the red flags in that. But again, opportunity for us to be thinking about that at the very start, you know, of the policies that we might be putting in place through the NEPS process.
I think the German government, their long-term policy really provided certainty for the workforce to also upskill and train themselves. I think having sort of short-term programs, that's not really going to cut it when you're trying to build these skills. You need to have something that people can really invest a business and start to you know, create a livelihood about it. And the other point I was going to make is rethinking skills, because I think what we did here in Australia, I believe it was with solar panels, is like really understanding the skills that needed to install solar panels. We brought down the price of that installation by just needing one person to do it. We could do that with heat pumps if we start thinking about what skills we need. Maybe you don't need a plumber and an electrician, you need just one person that has a diversification of skills that can do that. Yeah, and I think having people that can understand that holistic building, how it all works together is probably also important. Understanding the insulation, the heat pumps, the solar panels, how they all work together, because I think having people undo the good work of having the insulation put in and undoing it, I think is it puts us back at the start again.
And Luke, I might put you on the spot as well in a minute, but one thing we haven't really mentioned much. So we talked all about all the things that we're really interested in Germany and that we could either adapt or learn from and bring it over here. But I think there were a few things where it was actually the other way around, where we actually went there to get some perspective on like, oh, wow, there's some things where we're actually really leading. And one of those sectors is actually commercial buildings, where the story of the amazing residential story in Germany, they've actually really struggled on non-residential and much more than they have on the residential market. And in the same amount of time, we're actually seeing a revolution on energy efficiency and decarbonization, particularly in sectors like offices and shopping centers here in Australia. And that contrast were quite stark. And maybe just one of the reasons, and to bring it back to some of the lessons that we talked about in residential, one of those reasons is because we have had a very long-term set of policies and initiatives that drive decarbonization in buildings. We have initiatives like Neighbours that are working, but also Green Star, we have the building code, and those three are really the foundation for new and existing buildings in sustainability. They're the same tools across the country. So any any policy that drives any one of them is actually creating the same incentives across the board, driving the whole industry forward. And they've been really a foundation for getting perhaps the biggest reduction of energy consumption of any building sectors in any country during that decade. And I think to me it was like, again, it's like the same lessons that long-term policy frameworks, government leaderships, and also policies that create markets are really important to actually build skills. And I think skills in commercial buildings in Australia are actually incredibly high. We have a very skilled workforce. We have great products. We have lots of very sophisticated companies in the energy services. A lot of them are your members, Luke. So I might just put you on the spot on what's your reflection on commercial buildings in Germany, and what's the lesson there for us?
So the commercial building stock, is nominally rated with the Energy Performance Certificate, which is an EU-wide requirement, but it's more about the characteristics of the building. It's updated very infrequently. It isn't like Neighbours, a reflection of the actual performance of a building. And as we know, a commercial building can have great kit and be poorly run and be very inefficient, or it can be kind of like an older building that is well run and it can be very efficient. And so, we don't need to re-prosecute the wonders of Neighbours here, but the fact that you do have that accurate reflection of performance in commercial buildings has been transformative, particularly in the office sector. We have a great ecosystem of skills and products, as you say, in the commercial building space. One of the things that is worth reflecting on, though, is as we contemplate hopefully expanding things like disclosure to other parts of the commercial building market, you're often dealing, not always. Sometimes it's the same owners, but oftentimes not, and potentially less sophistication within the business. And so there's going to be a need to continue expanding that kind of ecosystem of skills around the commercial building space. Sitting here now as an organisation with interests in, members that have interest in right across the economy, I feel a lot more confident about our ability to do that in the commercial building sector relatively quickly, because we have such a good staging point relative to the residential space where we don't have that solid foundation of the ecosystem, and we need to get it going. For eagle-eyed viewers at home, you'll note that we've seamlessly transitioned into theme 3, which is workforce development. Carlos did that about 15 minutes ago, but I think it's useful we did so, because when you think about the ecosystem, which was the previous theme, it's actually there's the disclosure tool, there's the finance, which we talked about a little bit, and there's the people that actually do the work and the quality of that work and the confidence in it. And those 3 things working together are absolutely crucial. They're kind of like the pillars, I would argue, of the equation that we need to build. And I just echo what everybody said about ambition, but also long-term policy. We find ourselves in these moments increasingly regularly, it seems, where it would have been really good to have had some big energy efficiency programs 5 to 10 years ago, so the crisis that we find ourselves in wouldn't be so crisisy. And one finds oneself in the position of saying, well, gee, I wish we had a time machine. We don't have a time machine, but let's get started now. So when the next crisis rolls around, we've got that increased resilience, and we're not having the impacts that we're having. When I reflect about the challenges that businesses and households are facing on the energy front in 2022, and that's going to happen. That's unfortunately likely to continue for some time. Thank God there's been some state-based effort on this front, largely through the efficiency obligations that exist in New South Wales, Victoria, ACT and South Australia, because if they did not exist, the challenges that are being faced out there would be even worse. But there's so much more that we could have done, so much more. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to drive that, just from it's a resilience piece, and it's a quality of life piece. And it's like we live in such a blessed country. The idea that we wouldn't be taking this on, as no one should have to live in a crap home. It's kind of that simple, right?
Yeah. There were a couple of, I think, elements of this conversation around skills and looking at what's there in Germany and working well, that I also think should give us a moment to pause and make sure that we, I think we're all feeling a sense of urgency, but therein lies a bit of a risk if you are careless with program design around some of these things. I think governments open themselves up to risk. And I find myself reflecting on I think part of the reason I think governments of both sides have really not wanted to engage in the efficiency space is a legacy of, some issues with rollout of previous programs. And I think if that happened again here, I really fear for the efficiency movement in this country, noting how much it's scared off governments in the last 10 years. So along those lines, I thought agree with everything that you've both said on that. And one of, I think, the really fundamental strengths of the Neighbours program in Australia, and it's present in Germany in the way that they do their residential upgrades, is this notion of the professional that's involved, the auditing and the quality assurance that sits around those professionals as well. In Neighbours, it's directly overseen by government through the Neighbours team. You've worked over time to, I think, take a fairly sophisticated approach to the auditing regime that the thing that's relevant here as well is sorry, I was just getting a call on my mobile that cut into my speakers. So it's the auditing thing, but also that it's not done at arm's length from government. And I think if we're noting that we need to deliver this at scale, and we note that there are many thousands of assessors that perhaps are not, on board yet, or will be retrained or reskilling and coming into programs like this. I think government needs to have a think about how it manages that from a quality assurance perspective. I think there's some inherent tension there about the desire to move quickly, and perhaps the need for governments in the first instance to maintain a closer relationship to the accreditation and, sort of ongoing QA around those professionals. And, I think if that's managed poorly, it opens government up to some risk around, poor quality of retrofits and things like that, which no one here wants to see. And we want to see quality programs, rolled out with urgency at scale, but we need to make sure that we get those fundamentals right.
All right. Because of the time, and we have one more theme to address. Frankie, you've really held yourself back to date in this webinar. There hasn't been too many shout outs to heat pumps, but it was a real theme. And going back to what you said at the start of the webinar, being there when we were in June 2022, when it was only 3 or 4 months after the invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, this is going to be a long-term challenge that Europe is grappling with for years to come. But it was incredibly raw at that moment, and there was policy being made while we were there in this space, and the role of electrification in particular in the context of that imperative to get off Russian gas. It was in the air, in quite a remarkable way. What are your reflections on that key theme that I wasn't anticipating that it would be as big a deal as it was in the 4 days that we were there?
And I think partially our function as well of the time that we were there. So I think mentioned at the front, unprecedented crisis and focus from the German government on diversifying away from, fossil gas imported from Russia. And so they were building on, I think, what had been fairly significant history in terms of German manufacturing of heat pumps, but really seeking to, to ramp up and sort of do it at scale really quickly at an unprecedented rate. I think while we were there, they launched a thing. I think they were calling the heat pump assault. Like they were invoking the language.
I think it's the offensive, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Heat
pump offensive. That's right. And so they were announcing an intention to be installing, I think, 500,000 heat pumps a year, by the next couple of years' time, and something in the order of 6 million of them by 2030. So huge, huge ambition there. Interesting then in the context of the current crisis to reflect on where sort of the manufacturing movement in Germany really started and sort of had its foundations in another crisis, being the oil crisis of the 70s, and that had really fostered a focus on efficiency, and I think started the shift away, or a focus away from fossil gas for heating, even though it's it's still very prevalent there, but their manufacturing base from companies that traditionally manufactured gas heating started to diversify into heat pumps, and that sort of probably didn't get the same kind of focus from governments in previous decades potentially that is now. But that, so it was fundamental that they have an industry there, we all know sort of Germany prides itself in its manufacturing capability, and that's something that's very front and center from the German government's approach for their energy transition, as well as the opportunities for German industry. So I think that's an important piece of context. But the other, I think, really fascinating thing about understanding not just where the ambition of the government was going, but all the kinds of program design and incentives that they were thinking at, really throwing at the problem to make sure that they could be meeting that level of ambition. I think some of the novel things that we saw and reflected on was, the role of targeting installers as a key, sort of influencer and person to people to convince away where possible to offer, gas heating installation, and instead convert them to reorient their business models around heat pump installation, and that there was both an incentive for the installer in that, but that was also combined with incentives from the government in terms of the like a rebate on the actual appliance itself, and that was sort of being worked into KfW finance and grants as well. So it's all those things working together, trying to create a really compelling case for people to convert away from fossil gas to heat pumps. I think the focus on in the installer, and I think we already spoke about this, Rachel and Carlos talked about looking at how you combine skill sets to bring costs down for installation as well, noting that, in Australia, you might need both an electrician, and a plumber to do installations. And if we were going to really innovate the rollout of this in Australia, we need to, start thinking about what the business models for that look like.
Frank, if I could complement that with your answer at the macro level with some of the micro detail that we saw on the ground, I think one of the great things about having a really active market with lots of people installing equipment is that you actually see lots of different answers and solutions to some of the barriers that we talk about in the theoretical. So every time there's a conversation about heat pumps in Australia, somebody will raise, but there's not enough space. We can't do this in not enough space. Well, there isn't enough space anywhere. You can make that argument in any country around the world. Germany is installing hundreds of thousands of heat pumps. And so we actually saw on the ground lots of solutions to that. And there's like many solutions, from instead of having one giant heat pump, having multiple smaller heat pumps in different places, from using communal spaces. And we saw a bunch of people literally digging a hole in the ground, putting a heat pump, covering, and then having grass. You never knew that it was there, but it's actually using that space when you don't have enough inside. All kinds of solutions. And I think that is the importance of experience, because those solutions are available to us in Australia, and almost every building can electrify. But if we don't actually get enough experience, we're just going to keep talking about these theoretical barriers, and they sound insurmountable unless you actually see it in practice, how many other people are actually going around that problem.
There are a couple of other kind of fundamentals in place in Germany that we don't have yet in Australia. I know there was a real focus on the conversation around standards and having like quality standards for the products themselves and also the installation. So we're behind on that, right? Like we don't have a standard approach across Australia for those things. And I think what was really interesting hearing from a manufacturer's perspective, like we had a lovely delegate, Glenn from Steve Welch on in our trip as well, was that, I think there's also a lot of concern for manufacturers of quality products that they don't want to see us rush towards incentives and, a lot of the sort of large scale rollout measures before getting those quality controls in place as well, because then you again, like, and I don't want to be the person who keeps talking about risk here, but like that's something to be aware of. Like we don't want to be a market flooded with with low quality product that's also then gonna flow through to consumer satisfaction and and their desire or not to do more on things like efficiency. So that was something that they got right. And I think informing that was, they'd had an established association for heat pump manufacturers that meant that, the whole industry came together to think about those challenges. That's also not present here in Australia, really. Like you have what looks like collaboration, but it's not as organised perhaps as it could be. And so I think those things are also really important, sort of foundational elements for us to look at in terms of building that, sort of supportive ecosystem as well.
The other thing that it goes to that supply issue, and I completely agree that getting those standards in place, particularly for hot water, are super crucial. And I think there's work underway on that front in Australia, but we're way behind. But also the supply chain issues, I think, were really front and center when we're thinking about how we're actually going to manufacture all these heat pumps in a scenario where countries right around the world are coming to the same conclusion at the same time. We need a shed load of heat pumps. And you saw manufacturers in Europe making major investments in capacity of their facilities, but for the most part, that demand is being soaked up in a European context, and you're seeing that around the world, that local demand is often kind of being met first and foremost. It kind of created some really interesting conversations, and this is one of the topics that we were unpicking over dinner on at least a couple of nights, Rachel. But how you sort of grapple with that as a nation that is likely to see a massive spike in demand for heat pumps, doesn't have a lot of domestic manufacturing in this space. There's some componentry, but not a lot else. And there's an interest from state governments in, well, is this part of the basket of clean technologies that we want to sort of invest in? Because there's a critical role that it's going to play in the transition. There's also a geopolitical lens to all of this, which is fascinating. And critical components of heat pumps being sourced in China. Is that something that we feel comfortable with, on how do we build those alliances that ensure that we continue to have the supply in a range of different scenarios, because we're potentially heading into an ever more uncertain time geopolitically in this region as well.
Yeah, Luke, I think I don't know if I have an answer for that, so let's just keep digging on the problem.
Disgraceful.
But I think we are actually experiencing this issue already with electric vehicles, right? So the Australian market is relatively small. We haven't had a lot of very ambitious policies until very recently. And because of that, we've been deprioritized as a market to send electric vehicles by most car manufacturers. And because of that, we're trailing a lot of developed economies on the penetration of electric vehicles. And if you want to buy one today, often there's like really long waiting lists that you have to wait for a long time. So the demand is bigger than the supply at the moment. I think the difference with electric vehicles, though, is that the car industry globally has already demonstrated that they can supply the world with cars, and they're in transition. But you can hope that within 5, 10, 15 years, they will be able to supply the world with electric vehicles to the demand that is needed. I think the difference is that the heat pump industry globally has never, ever supplied the world with the level of heat pumps that most reports are saying that industry needs to scale up. And that is a drastically different problem, because the scramble for heat pumps is going to be stronger. And a lot of heat pump manufacturers are either in China or in Europe. Both of those countries are going to require, and regions, an enormous amount of heat pumps themselves. And so there is a genuine question about whether there will be enough heat pump manufacturing capacity by the same producers and regions that are producing them today to actually meet the requirements of the world. It's an open question. We'll find out in the future. Until we have a time machine, it's a risk that we need to manage. And one of those ways of managing is, is there a case for a country like Australia to actually have a domestic industry where at least some of that is actually manufactured locally? It wouldn't be the first time we do that. There's other areas like, a lot of gas boilers are made in Australia. Obviously, heat pumps are in perhaps one step further in terms of complexity, but it's if we're actually doing it in some products, we kind of proven to ourselves that we could potentially do this in the heat pump industry. And the fact that it's a strategic risk as a country, I think makes it a really interesting topic for policymaking. I'm going to leave it there. I think I feel like I've just gone deeper into the whole of how big the problem is, but I wonder if any other our fellow panelists would like to solve this problem for us.
I don't have any solutions at all there. I think that's very interesting, but I was going to slightly diverse the conversation when we saw the heat pumps being done at a district level, and then at the Tegel, again, the Tegel case study. I'm just wondering if that is a model that you could apply here in Australia, where you're sort of thinking more at a precinct level rather than just an individual building.
I think you go, Frankie.
Oh, no, I mean, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about that. I've got thoughts.
Oh well, my reflection on that is that there's an incredible culture in Europe around district solutions, and a lot of the regulatory regimes in Europe are set up to accommodate that. I think that, you know, and we have, the EEC has members that, you know, operate across Australia and Europe and have deep expertise in this space, and, you know, it's something that, you know, one could plausibly do. I think that expertise in district heating is also flowing through to the kind of the knowledge and skills that are being brought to bear for more complex retrofits, like the ones that Carlos was referring to in apartment buildings, because there's just more engineers that are more used to thinking in creative ways about how you move heat around and how you solve a solution. And we have, you know, and we've all talked about this, there is a bit of a mindset of kind of like for like replacement. Pull out a boiler, put in an equivalent capacity heat pump in the same space. Oh, that doesn't work. Oh dear, what do we do? Whereas in Germany, and we spoke to some of the experts, which was absolutely fascinating, taking us through their buildings and showing us how they sort of approach that same issue in a very creative way. And I think that's just that culture around, you know, those kind of system level solutions that are being brought to bear on those issues. They haven't solved every problem in Germany by any stretch of the imagination. It's not something that we can necessarily go and pluck that expertise and pop it down in Australia. And there are different solutions. They have far fewer very large commercial buildings in CBDs and the like than as compared to Australia. But I'll pause there so you can jump in, Frankie, and add your bit.
Well, I think a lot of the examples of district heating that we saw in Germany were in a residential context, not a commercial one. So I'm not sure that that the comparison sort of directly translates. That, you know, we're sort of also in an urban context in the, you know, so German city that we're in Berlin. It was a reasonably sort of dense, you know, sort of medium density residential kind of population integrated through the city, which again is not replicated in a lot of you know, in a lot of Australian cities. So I sort of tend to agree with Luke in that I think it might end up being dictated by the constraints within existing precincts and the sort of retrofit case that needs to be solved for. I think it sort of goes from the scale that Carlos was talking about. I almost feel like some of the retrofits that the manufacturers in Germany that we were looking at were doing within an apartment building was almost like a district sort of approach within a building, because you had this you know, sort of a smaller centralized heat pump and then boosters you know, on individual floors. And that was a bit of a paradigm shift, I think, to the way that we've designed buildings here in Australia, where it's sort of, you know, the one big centralized system taking up space in the basement, and indeed separating heating and cooling, right? Like we've got our chillers in the basement and gas boilers there and cooling towers on the roof, and they're not integrated. And when we had a visit from Thomas Novak, heat pump, you know, Tsar of Europe, he's like, why don't you have integrated heating and cooling in your large commercial buildings? So I sort of think all of this really presents an opportunity to re-examine the way we do things in a retrofit context. But and it sort of goes to one of the pet projects I'd really like to see get off the ground that we heard about when we were in Germany, where from a commercial building perspective, a manufacturer had partnered with a portfolio owner and looked at separating out their portfolio into a few different typologies and developing like a playbook for retrofitting buildings that sort of fit within that typology. So I think it's, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's sort of going to be one solution that fits across the spectrum. And it may well be that, you know, that district approaches or a version of that is looked at in some contexts. But I also think, you know, people have been burned by the idea of cogen systems in basements across the city of Sydney, and probably will have an amount of skepticism about some of those solutions.
Can I give a bit of a shout out to Kieran on the
That's
chat?
where I was about to go.
Oh, great.
I think everyone listening at home has been hanging on every word and hasn't had time to type questions in. So, but we've had one, and I do want to address it, which is Kieran's question about the lack of standards for particularly hot water heat pumps in Australia. Carlos, it sounded like you wanted to chip in on that.
No, I was going to say that I think is really important. I mean, if you look at every country that's done really well in heat pumps, they actually have minimum energy performance standards. They have labeling systems. They have requirements for those systems to be the default heating system in building codes. So if you want to, even if they don't ban gas, if you want to install gas, then you have to work much harder on the rest of the building to actually meet the standard. So we actually currently have none of those. And I think is, you know, that I think that's a direct takeaway for me, that, you know, how long is it going to take us to actually have those policies in place? Those policies have worked wonders in almost all the other building technologies in buildings. So I see no reason why we shouldn't take the step and actually introduce those. I think part of the reason why we haven't is because the market for heat pumps in Australia historically has been much smaller than in a lot of countries in Europe. But now that we have realized from a policy making stance that we need to drive that market and we need to do a lot more work on heat pumps, we really need to build all the infrastructure that is going to allow us to do this really efficiently. And Frankie made that point about that. We don't want a country with really inefficient, unsafe equipment. We actually want high quality, good installations, and that requires, you know, us working on the infrastructure that we put in place as governments.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're reaching the conclusion of our webinar. I'm going to ask you all one last question, which is, you know, we've mentioned this moment of policy opportunity that we are at here in Australia. National Energy Performance Strategy is something which is currently out for consultation at the federal level, but you know, we've also got state governments, you know, considering their pathway forward. We just had an election in Victoria, which has seen that government commit to a 75 to 80% emissions reduction target by 2035, and that's going to require all hands on deck and all policies on the table to reach that very ambitious target, which I think is really setting the pace for where other states and indeed the federal government are going to be judged against as they look to their 2035 targets. So, energy efficiency, Germany. What is the big idea or the key insight that you want to leave our viewers with that we should be considering as we head into 2023? What can we learn from Germany? How should we take this whole agenda forward? All right, Frankie, you go.
Just one thing.
Yeah, just one thing.
I don't deal well with one.
It's so hard.
Frankie, we've just talked for almost an hour and a half, so you said a lot of other things. So just pick one.
I mean,
I'm happy to jump in one quickly.
All right,
Frankie,
Carlos, give Frankie some thinking time.
I'm finding it hard to choose.
So my one thing, we talked about like 20 already, but my one thing is taking a step out. Germany has realized that energy efficiency is not just about saving money, which is good. It's not just about saving emissions today, which is also good, but it's also about providing relief for the energy system as we electrify everything. The demand for energy consumption and electricity is going to blow up in the next 20 years because of electric vehicles, hydrogen, heat pumps, all of that is increasing demand. Buildings can reduce an enormous amount of energy. The building sector is full of inefficiency in all countries, not just in Australia. And they realize that is maybe the one lever that government has to be able to reduce, and temper the pace at which electricity consumption is going to grow. So they're basically saying, we're going to use this lever, not just save money, not just save emissions today, but we're going to make the transition to net zero emissions by 2045 in the case of Germany. Cheaper, easier, with less generation, less transmission cost. And we're going to go all in on that. And we're going to set targets to make sure that we achieve that. To me, that is incredibly ambitious, very well coordinated, foresight into the future as well. And I think is a really good takeaway lesson for a lot of policymakers and people who work in government like myself.
That's a good one. I reckon mine builds a little bit on what you're saying there, Carlos, and maybe it goes to targets in the way that we think about energy efficiency moving forward. I'm not underestimating the challenge of that energy transition, and a lot of work's going to happen in the next decade on that. I think there's a risk in the long-term proposition of an efficiency movement in this country when you have cheap, plentiful, renewable energy. And so I think, and we've talked about this at times, I think in the longer term, the focus is also going to be around people's health and comfort. Reflecting on the government's first annual climate change statement released 2 weeks ago, 2019 being the hottest year on record is going to be an average year in Australia if we're dealing with limiting things to a 1.5 degree future. So I am quite keen for things like the National Energy Performance Strategy to think about targets in the context of health outcomes as well. And I think, sort of drawing on Rachel's comments previously, embedding a whole of government approach to dealing with this, so that it's not just a responsibility of an energy minister or someone with responsibility within a climate change portfolio, but that that there is a really strong economic case for this. I think another comment from Kieran was that there are heat pump manufacturers in this country, and actually there's a really strong rationale for our not just our energy security, but our economic prospects to invest in in sort of the skills and manufacturing base that energy efficiency, its movement leads on. The security element's probably underplayed, but there's there's that in the mix as well as health. So I would like that the strategy takes a really broad view of those things.
I think you managed to get 3 things into your one more thing.
You stole mine.
Mission accomplished. Sorry, Rachel.
It's okay. I was going to say that whole of government approach, I think that's actually really powerful. It brings coordination and integration, and that lens other than just sustainability. So it's holistic and consistent. So just to build off that, then I thought the process of us going to Germany and learning from them was so rich, and I think learning from other jurisdictions and between the states as well as with other international countries, we're all sort of in the same place where we're all trying to get to the end goal at the same time, and nobody's really doing everything well. So learning from those other jurisdictions, I think, who are doing well in certain things that we're not as good at, can just skip over any mistakes and hopefully fast track our activity here.
Thanks, Rachel. Carlos, you have a final comment?
An extra. In 1996 or 1997, Alan Pierce, who's actually in this attending this session, did an international trip about learning from the experience of other countries when it came to building sustainability. He came back. It was a report done for, eventually became Neighbours. And one of the things that came out of that is that Neighbours, he recommended that Neighbours should be based on metering, not based on features. And a lot of what's happened since is because of that trip and learning lessons from other countries. A lot of the countries that those lessons were learned from were European countries that actually went in a different direction later on. And I think that, to me, is such a good example of why learning from the success and mistakes of other countries and adapting those things to our own can make such a big difference in the long term.
Carlos, Rachel, Frankie, thank you for being so generous with your time, both today, but also contributing to the creation of this report. I want to thank the New South Wales and Victorian governments, particularly Rachel's team at OECC, but also Solar Victoria in Victoria, for supporting Patrick Crittenden, who did an outstanding job capturing these insights and crystallising them in a short report. Patrick, it's a tough gig coming in at the end and kind of capturing all that, but you've done an outstanding job. Adelphi, particularly Franziska, who's also on the line, who is the connective tissue between Australia and Germany on this whole partnership. RENAC, who took care of us on the ground in Berlin. Obviously, the German government, incredible support for the delegation, and it was incredibly rich. Really solidified this close relationship, and has created an incredible basis to move forward on this agenda, which is happening. We're having conversations about the financing piece in Australia informed by Germany, and there's an ongoing conversation about how neighbours can be leveraged in a German context, which is incredibly exciting. My former co-chair, Christoph von Spessart, who has now moved on to another role, but was fundamental in getting this momentum built, along with his organisation, the German Australian Chamber of Commerce in Industry. Of course, the German and the Australian government, who kind of hold the space in terms of that bilateral collaboration and allow all this magic to happen. But I have to close by giving a shout out to all the other delegation members: Grace Tam Cutler, Fox Reynolds, Isaac Ward, Margot Delafalouz, Paul Corkle, Glenn Day, Martina Lyons, and Holly Taylor. It was, as everyone said, a remarkable privilege to spend that week with all of you, and to the degree that we have insights, it is supported in a very profound way by the conversations and the expertise that you all contributed, both to the report and to also our understanding of how all these complex issues fit together. So there you go. I commend the report to you, and I think one thing that no one will be any doubt about is that you bail up any of us and we will talk you underwater for as long as you will listen about the insights from this trip. So don't hesitate to reach out if that's of interest. But season's greetings. Have a great break. And if I don't see you over the next few days, I'll catch you in 2023. Thanks, everybody.